You pressed play, but something else might be listening too. Can I ask you something? Where are you right now? And what time is it there? Tell me in the comments. Just don't listen too closely. Some things hear it when you do. It had begun the day after the tablet had been taken away. Samuel hadn't screamed. He hadn't argued. He had simply gone, still unnaturally so, for a child of 9. His fingers, once twitching from too many hours of screen time, had turned to pencils. The silence in his room had grown thick, a kind of silence that didn't invite attention. It warned against it. The door had been pushed open gently. The intention had been clear. Comfort, maybe distraction. A glance inside had revealed him seated at his desk, head down, hand moving with relentless speed over paper. The sound of the pencil scratching had filled the air like distant static, aggressive, frenzied. What are you working on? The question had been offered softly. No answer. Steps had been taken closer. The drawing had begun to take shape. It had shown their grandmother, twisted in a way no human body should be. Her torso had been folded inward, knees shoved beneath ribs, arms pinned behind her back. She had been drawn inside a crate, her face wide-eyed, mouth slack. A label on the side of the box had read fragile. The paper had been snatched away. A protest had not been made, only a whisper. It's already done. No further explanation had been given. Dinner had been quiet. Grandmother had excused herself afterward, murmuring about needing fresh air. Her coat had been pulled over thin shoulders. The door had closed behind her. She had not returned. Morning had brought with it sirens, then neighbors, then tape, yellow, stretched across the lawn like warning veins. A hiker had discovered something deep in the wooded edge of the nearby trail. Authorities had used words like tragic and unimaginable. What had been found matched the drawing in disturbing detail. Inside, a discarded shipping crate. Behind a maintenance shed, the old woman's body had been discovered, contorted, broken, and labeled. The thought of coincidence had been entertained. Briefly, it had been rationalized, catalogued, then reluctantly dismissed. But the shadow of doubt had taken root. The funeral had come with rain, heavy, loud, and unrelenting, the kind that seemed to soak through umbrellas and skin alike. Afterward, the house had returned to stillness. The television had been turned on, not for entertainment, but to fill the spaces between breaths. Samuel had sat beside his older cousin, knees tucked to chest, eyes half-lidded. Their guardian uncle this time, not father, had stepped into the room. Everyone holding up okay. A nod had been offered. A lie, but a polite one. I was thinking of picking up dinner from that Thai place. Your favorite. The response had been quiet. That sounds good. But then Samuel had turned his head, slowly, deliberately. His voice had come out flat and unfamiliar. I'm glad she's dead. The room had changed instantly. He had stood, brushing past, with a weight not befitting his size, climbing the stairs in silence. His uncle had stared after him, then back at the cousin. No words had come. I think he's just not processing this well, had finally been said. That's not like him. The door had closed behind the uncle. He had not returned. Night had passed without word. No text, no headlights in the driveway. The call had come after sunrise. There had been an accident on the eastbound highway. A cargo truck had lost part of its load, sheets of industrial metal, and one had collided with a sedan. The car had been torn open like paper. The driver had been nearly cut in half. His upper body had landed several meters from the wreckage. The drawing had already been found. It had been left on Samuel's desk, sitting in plain view. It had shown the exact event in pencil lines, sketched with precision no child should possess. The crushed car, the twisted figure, the metal. It was no longer a coincidence. It was a pattern. When the paperwork had cleared, custody had been transferred. A great aunt, distant but kind-hearted, had agreed to take in both children. The state had viewed the decision as favorable. A safe, suburban neighborhood, a stable home. Boxes had been unpacked. A guest room had been shared. New routines had been constructed. But Samuel's room had remained his own. He had not spoken much since the funeral. He had drawn more often, always with the door closed. The cousin, older by 5 years, had begun to document things, events, details, timestamps, not out of paranoia, but necessity. This wasn't imagination. This was happening. And then, the moment had arrived. A small disagreement had sparked it, barely more than a raised voice and a slammed door. But for Samuel it had been enough. The cousin had stormed out. Minutes later, the sound of a window being opened had been heard from upstairs. A gut feeling had ignited, and feet had moved fast up the steps. By the time the bedroom door had been pushed open, it had already been too late. The wind had carried the drawing far into the sky. Samuel had stood by the window, blank-faced, hands still smudged with graphite. No resistance had been offered when questioned. He had simply turned back to his desk. The search had gone on for hours. Backyards had been canvassed, fences checked, bushes inspected. The wind had been cruel, erratic, strong enough to carry paper beyond reach in seconds. The drawing had never been recovered, and that night, fear had taken its seat in the house like a guest that could not be asked to leave. The cousin had refused to sleep. The door had been locked. Every window had been double-checked. Lights had been left on. Knives had been hidden. And still, the breath had refused to come easy, because the image had already been seen, briefly, before the paper flew. It had been a house, this house, and on the doorstep, a figure had stood with something in their hand, long, sharp. At the center of the drawing had been a second figure, headless. A fountain of red had sprayed upward. The face, his face, had been discarded to the side, expression frozen mid-scream. And now, there was only waiting. And then, the doorbell rang. The chime had echoed through the hall. Once, then again, a sound too familiar to be threatening. But in that moment it had struck like thunder, sharp, immediate, impossible to ignore. No movement had followed. The living room remained still, except for the dull hum of the lamp, casting tired yellow across the floorboards. Shadows clung to the corners, patient and quiet. The door had not been approached. Instead, the breath had been held. The ear had turned toward the hallway, toward the front entrance, waiting for footsteps, voices, some signal of the ordinary. But nothing had followed. Only that faint creak of the wind outside brushing branches against the siding. Fingers had tightened around the couch fabric. Legs had curled in. And for a long while nothing had moved. Eventually, the chime came again. A third time. Slower, measured, like a knock dressed in civility. The lock had been confirmed. The deadbolt, double-checked. Curtains remained untouched. And still, dread crept through the skin like frost, not because of what was at the door, but because of what had already been drawn. The image had returned, uninvited and perfect in detail. The steps, the porch light, the door slightly ajar, and the figure, holding something in their hand, blurred by motion, but undeniably lethal in shape. And there, just behind, the second figure slumped forward, neck arched unnaturally, head absent. The trail of red had been drawn with chaotic motion, smearing down steps and across grass. That second figure had been unmistakable. It had been him. Time had warped, An hour might have passed, perhaps more. The doorbell had not rung again. The silence had felt sharper now, like it waited for confirmation that fear had taken hold. Eventually, footsteps had been heard upstairs. Soft, quick, and then a door closing with calculated calm. The cousin had known it was Samuel. There had been no desire to follow. Instead, the eyes had remained locked on the hallway entrance. The next morning arrived not with light, but with pale gray smothering the windows. Breakfast had gone untouched. Samuel had not appeared. His door had remained shut. The guardian, and by name, distant by blood, had left early for errands. A list had been left on the counter. A smiley face had been drawn beside it. The cousin hadn't smiled back. The front door had been avoided. So had windows. The air in the house had changed. Heavy now, sticky with something unnamed. By mid-afternoon, the cousin had approached Samuel's door, knocked once, then again. No response. The handle had been turned. Inside, the room had been cold. A window slightly ajar. The blinds rattled. Samuel sat at his desk, unmoving. Before asking anything, the cousin's eyes had fallen on the desk. Another drawing lay unfinished. It had not yet been touched by the wind, but what had been sketched so far had stopped the breath in his throat. The scene showed two children. One was Samuel. The other had been unidentifiable at first, drawn partially, erased several times, redrawn in tighter, thinner lines. They stood beneath a large tree, hands interlinked. Around them the ground had been torn apart, roots exposed, soil carved into spirals. In the branches, figures hung upside down, eyes closed, mouths open wide in silent screams. Above the tree, the sky had been filled with symbols, not letters, not language, but shapes that seemed to move even on still paper. The cousin had reached for the drawing, but Samuel's hand had gripped the edge, firmly. No words had been spoken. The cousin had backed away. In the following days, the cousin had stopped documenting the events by journal. Instead, notes had been left on a password-protected file. Time-stamped recordings had been made with a cracked phone. All details had been preserved electronically, in case proof would be needed one day. For someone else, for anyone else. Then the animals began disappearing. Bird feeders emptied but never refilled. Squirrels, once common along the back fence, stopped appearing. The neighborhood cat that prowled the driveway at dusk had not returned, and in their place came noises, scraping under floorboards, rustling inside vents, whispers through heating grates that carried no air. The ant had noticed none of it, or had chosen not to. She had begun walking slower. Her hands had started trembling, but no complaints had been offered. Her smile remained fixed, like a painting hung crooked that no one dared to straighten. Then one evening, Samuel spoke again. He had stood in the doorway of the guest room, watching. The cousin had looked up from their phone, startled. Samuel's voice had been calm. "I'm not going to draw again." The cousin had stared at him, unsure. Samuel's hands had been behind his back. His next sentence had carried no emotion. "I don't need to." He had turned and walked away. The hallway had stretched behind him. Unnaturally long, shadows had followed. The door at the end had closed, and that night, the cousin had found sleep impossible, because something about the way he had said, it didn't sound like peace. It had sounded like surrender. The week that followed had unfolded like fog, without shape, without warning, seeping into every corner of the house. Samuel had not drawn again. That much had been true, but the tension had not lifted. If anything, it had settled deeper into the bones of the home, like damp rot behind walls. Each morning had begun the same. Silence in the hallway, the smell of old dust and untouched breakfast, the aunt's voice, cheerful yet brittle, echoing from the kitchen, words directed at no one in particular. Samuel had barely been seen. His door had remained closed more often. Lights beneath it had flickered late into the night. On some mornings, strange odors had drifted through the vents, acrid, metallic, like copper left too long in rain. The cousin had watched, had waited, had written nothing, until one morning, something had changed. The door to Samuel's room had been left ajar. That alone had been cause enough for alarm. It had always been closed, not just for privacy, but as a seal, a barrier, and yet now it gaped open like a wound. Inside, the bed had been neatly made, the desk clear, but on the far wall, what had once been blank had been covered entirely in markings, not drawings, scratches, symbols carved deep into the plaster, some still flaking with white dust, circular patterns, thin, winding lines that intersected like veins, figures without faces, eyes without lids, hands with too many fingers. The cousin had backed away slowly. Samuel had been standing in the hallway, watching. His eyes had been wide, pupils stretched into black oceans. He had not blinked. No words had been exchanged. Later that evening, the aunt had returned from her errands with bags full of canned goods and batteries. When asked about the sudden supply haul, she had smiled faintly and said it was just in case. When pressed further, she had offered nothing else. Her hands had been shaking again. That night, a sound had broken the stillness, not loud, but deliberate. A metallic creak, followed by a shuffle. The noise had come from the attic. The cousin had risen slowly, heart hammering against ribs. Every instinct had screamed to stay still, to wait for daylight. But curiosity had outweighed caution. The attic door had been opened with shaking hands. Dust had swirled like ash in the narrow beam of the flashlight. Each step up the old ladder had sounded louder than it should have, wood groaning beneath unfamiliar weight. At the top, the air had been thick, heavy with age. Boxes had been pushed aside. An old trunk stood open in the corner, but its contents had been removed. And then, in the farthest corner, behind the rafters, something had been discovered. A small table. On it sat an unlit candle. Beside it, a paper. Another drawing. Not in pencil this time, but in ink. Deep, dark, and gleaming wet. The drawing had shown the house, no longer quiet, no longer whole. In the center of the image, the structure had been split in two. Roots had burst through the foundation, reaching outward like skeletal arms. Windows had been shattered, the roof torn as if by claws. Inside, 3 figures had stood, one for each occupant, but their faces had been voids. And around the house, dozens of smaller silhouettes had been drawn in a circle, kneeling, watching, worshipping. A sound had come from behind. The flashlight had turned. No one had been there, but the candle had lit by itself. The following days passed in a blur of tension. Samuel continued to say nothing. The aunt had become pale, distant, as if she were being drained slowly, and the cousin began waking with nosebleeds. Each morning, a small red stain had marked the pillow. Fingernails had begun to split. Skin felt cold even in warmth. Something inside the house had shifted. It wasn't just the drawings anymore. It was the space itself. Mirrors showed glimpses of motion not seen by the naked eye. Light bulbs flickered when no one moved. Doorways stretched, ever so slightly, as if the geometry of the house was no longer fixed. One evening, while brushing teeth, the cousin looked up from the sink and saw someone standing behind them in mirror. It was Samuel, but not as he had been. The boy in the reflection had been taller, his features sharper, eyes hollow. No whites, only black, like ink spilled across glass. The mouth had moved, but no words had come. When turned, the hallway had been empty. No footsteps, no door creak, just breath and silence. That night, the cousin had slept with the light on, and for the first time in years had whispered a prayer. The final day had not arrived with thunder or prophecy. It had begun quietly, too quietly. No birds had sung, no cars had passed outside. Even the trees beyond the window had stood perfectly still, as though the wind had been forbidden to enter. The cousin had awoken with a weight in their chest, not physical but present, a dread that could no longer be ignored. Samuel had already been seated at the kitchen table, hands folded, eyes blank. The aunt had placed a cup of tea before him with trembling hands. Neither had spoken. When asked how long they had been sitting there, no answer had come. The clock above the stove had ticked normally, but the time it marked was wrong, several hours wrong. The sky outside did not match the light in the room. The cousin had backed away, unsure if they were awake or still dreaming. By noon the drawing had returned. It had been left at the foot of the cousin's bed. No wind had carried it. No hand had been seen placing it. It had simply appeared. The paper had been thicker than before, textured, rough-edged. The ink had bled into the fibers like veins, and the image drawn upon it had been the most detailed yet. The house, again, but this time, the structure had been surrounded by fire, not in the usual sense, not orange or yellow, but in black flame, licking the walls without consuming them. Shadows moved inside the blaze, serpentine and tall. The three occupants had been drawn within. Samuel, the aunt and cousin. Each one had been marked. On Samuel's forehead a circle split by a vertical line. On the aunt's chest, a spiral of thorns. And on the cousin's throat, an open eye. At the edge of the page a single sentence had been scratched, not written. This one ends in silence. The aunt had been found hours later, collapsed at the bottom of the stairs. No bruises, no cuts, just stillness. Her heart had stopped, peacefully. According to the paramedics, there had been no sign of struggle, no fall, simply a pause. Her tea had remained untouched on the table. Samuel had said nothing. He had simply stood in the hallway watching her be taken away. That evening, the cousin had packed a bag. Keys had been taken. The front door had been opened, but the outside had not looked like it used to. The neighborhood had been wrong. Street signs had faded. Cars sat empty, unmoving, as though abandoned mid-parking. Trees leaned in unnatural angles. The sky had turned deep gray, but no clouds moved. The house had become separate, as though it had slipped just out of phase with the rest of the world. The door had been closed again, locked. Windows had been covered, and then the lights had failed. Every bulb had gone dark in the same breath, and Samuel had begun to hum. Not a song, not even a melody, just a slow, low vibration of sound, echoing through the halls like breath in a crypt. From the top of the stairs, he had appeared, not running, not skipping, just descending, each step measured, each movement stiff, like a puppet pulled by string. In his hand, he had held paper. The final drawing. It had not been shown, only dropped at the cousin's feet. A faint smile had crept across his lips, and then he had turned and walked back into the dark. The doorbell rang, just once. No wind, no footsteps, no shadow cast beneath the frame. The cousin had not moved. The paper lay face down on the rug. It had not been touched. Not yet. The lights remained off. Only the pale glow of dusk crept between the blinds. And then the second chime, slower, heavier, a knock that wore the skin of a bell. Breath caught in the chest, because whatever had been drawn, whatever had been summoned, was no longer waiting to be seen. It had arrived, and silence swallowed everything. He had been young, too young, some whispered, for the burden of genius, and yet brilliance had arrived early and with sharp precision. From the first time his fingers touched ivory, there had been no question. Something otherworldly flowed through him. At only 12, Elias had already earned a place on the stage of one of the most respected symphonic halls in Europe. The invitation had come from the Royal Philharmonic Conservatory. The piece selected for his debut was none other than the Piano Concerto No. 2, a work known for its emotional depth and devastating beauty. To Elias, the concerto had not been just music. It had been prophecy, the culmination of every moment spent in solitude at the piano, every failed attempt at sleep, every heartbeat. But the beginning of this unraveling had not been the concerto. It had been the suggestion of a prelude. During the final rehearsal, Elias had quietly proposed that the concert open with a brief introduction, a short solo, one of his personal favorites. The conductor, intrigued by the idea, had approved. The piece chosen had been obscure to many, but not to those who knew the legacy of the composer behind it. It had been a haunting little work, the prelude in D-sharp minor, rarely played, often misunderstood. Unknown to Elias, its history had been drenched in legend. The story, buried beneath layers of myth and whispers, spoke of the composer's darkest years, years spent under public scrutiny, chained by expectation, crushed beneath the repetition of the very piece Elias now wished to perform. In a moment of desperation, the composer had allegedly made a pact with an esoteric society known for its ritualistic rites, the Crimson Veil, a group said to operate in shadows, believing music to be a conduit of possession. It was believed the composer had handed the piece over to them, sealed it with despair, cursed it so that no one who played it would leave unchanged. The melody would become a fingerprint on the soul, reshaping it slowly, quietly, permanently. But none of this had reached Elias. He had only felt admiration. And so, when the night of the performance arrived, he had stepped onto the stage beneath a dome of crystal chandeliers and breathless anticipation. The hall had been full. The Minister of Culture had taken his seat near the center aisle. The orchestra had stood tall behind him. The silence had been absolute. Then the first note. The moment his fingers pressed into the opening chord, a foreign sensation had crept into his arms. His wrists had stiffened. A tremor had seized the tips of his fingers. The keys, once familiar, had turned alien beneath his touch. His breath had caught. His vision had narrowed. And then stillness. The music had stopped. His hands had frozen, locked as if clutched by invisible iron. Gasps had rippled through the audience as he collapsed forward onto the piano. Chairs scraped against the floor. Panic moved like a wave. Elias had been carried from the stage by trembling hands, rushed into an ambulance. Monitors had been attached. Scans had been performed. Nothing. No fever. No injury. No neurological anomaly. He had awoken with a sense of confusion and a weight he could not name. No pain, yet a suffocating heaviness. A memory of pressure, not on his chest, but inside it. Something had entered. Something had stayed. But even so, the pull of the stage had not lessened. It had deepened. In the days that followed, the body had moved, but the mind had floated just beyond reach. Everything had returned to normal, or at least appeared to. Elias had smiled when spoken to. He had answered questions. He had nodded at concern. But at night, the surface cracked. The first dream had come 3 days before the rescheduled concert. He had not fallen asleep so much as been pulled downward, a sensation like sinking into cold velvet. When his eyes had opened within the dream, the house had felt unfamiliar. The walls had whispered with a language made of breath, and somewhere beneath him, a melody had begun to echo, slow, deliberate, dark. It had been the prelude, that same cursed piece. He had descended the staircase barefoot, the sound pulling him forward. Outside, a crowd had gathered, silent and unmoving, lit only by a low golden haze. In the center of the gathering, a long wooden box had waited, A coffin, approaching it, had felt inevitable. The air had resisted each step, thick and humming. As his gaze had dropped inside, the breath had left his lungs. It had been his own body, pale still, dressed in the same clothes he had worn during the first concert. But then the figure within had moved, its eyes had opened. His eyes, and a hand had risen from the chest to grip his arm. Cold fingers had clamped around his wrist, and a voice, shaped by no mouth but heard clearly, had whispered one phrase, "Don't do it." When he had awakened, his body had convulsed. His pillow had been soaked, at first mistaken for sweat, but the stain had been red. Blood had dripped from his nose in slow, sticky trails. His heartbeat had pounded like timpani in his ears. But even then, the warning had been ignored. The concert had remained his sole thought. The night of the performance arrived once more. The hall had been less full this time. Fewer officials, fewer lights. But one figure had stood out. Near the front, seated alone in the leftmost balcony, a man had watched with stillness unnatural to any living audience member. His clothing had been decades outdated, tailcoat and gloves pressed to perfection. His face had carried no emotion, only cold attention. Their eyes had met, and something ancient had passed between them. Still, Elias had sat at the piano. This time the prelude had been played without hesitation. The audience had breathed as one lulled into reverence, and then, effortlessly, he had moved into the concerto. Note after note poured from him as if the music had long awaited a body. When the final chord had thundered through the hall, the ovation had been immediate. But before he could leave the stage, the man from the balcony had appeared, impossibly close. His gloved hand had extended, and Elias, frozen by instinct, had accepted it. The handshake had been brief. The message whispered, unmistakable, "You shouldn't have done it." Then he had vanished. Later that evening, after returning home, Elias had approached the piano again, not out of discipline, but compulsion. His fingers had hovered above the keys, unsure, but the moment contact had been made, sound erupted. Not one note chosen, not one passage remembered, and yet his hands had played. They had moved with terrifying speed and flawless articulation. Piece after piece spilled from him, works he had never studied, some he didn't recognize at all. They carried a language of longing and fury. His veins swelled, his fingertips cracked and bled against the polished ivory. Still, the music did not stop. For hours he had played, a marionette pulled by spectral threads. When exhaustion had finally dragged him down, his body had slumped against the piano like an offering. Morning had arrived, cloaked in silence. The mother, upon entering his room, had found Elias draped over the piano, his shirt clinging to dried blood. Panic had seized her, but he had stirred before she could scream. His voice had been quiet, flat. He had explained the blood as nothing more than an accident. Fingernails caught between keys, perhaps. She had accepted it. But that night, and every night after, the pattern had repeated. The door had been locked from the inside. No lights had been turned on. Only music had drifted beneath the door, sometimes gentle, often violent. Melodies unknown to any living ear had been born in darkness and died before morning. He never wrote them down. He couldn't. By day Elias had moved like a ghost. He had smiled when spoken to. He had eaten only when reminded. His voice, once light and boyish, had dropped into strange cadences. His manner of speech had become precise, deliberate, as if recalling vocabulary from another tongue. The family had grown frightened. A psychologist had been summoned. The man had entered with polite skepticism, prepared to encounter signs of prodigious stress or attention-seeking behavior. But during the session something had shifted. Elias had spoken, and the psychologist had listened far longer than expected. What had begun as a clinical exchange evolved into a philosophical meditation. Elias had spoken of time, memory, mortality. His insights had been too refined, too seasoned for someone so young. When the hour had passed, the psychologist had emerged dazed but smiling. The family had waited for a diagnosis. Instead, he had offered only a gentle assurance. Elias was more stable than any child he'd met, exceptionally gifted, exceptionally aware. And then he had left, with eyes that had seen too much and understood too little. Months passed. The music continued, but Elias did not, or at least the Elias they had known. His posture had changed, back straighter, hands always folded neatly. His eyes no longer darted with curiosity. They observed, they studied, they waited. His wardrobe shifted. Tweed, pressed collars, stiff shoes. By then his compositions numbered in the dozens. He had ceased playing existing works. Everything that emerged from his fingers was new, grand, turbulent, old-fashioned, yet untouched by time. When an international composition competition opened its call for entries, Elias submitted without fanfare. During the live auditions, the jury had fallen into silence, not the respectful kind, the kind that follows an earthquake. When he stepped away from the piano, the room had held its breath, and then the sound applause, thunderous and slow building, had broken through like a flood. Whispers had begun to circulate, whispers of revival, of reincarnation, of possession. None dared say it aloud, but the question pulsed through the conservatories of Europe. How could a 12-year-old write like this? His next performance had been arranged in the composer's native land. He had not spoken during the flight. Upon arrival, he had asked for only one thing: to walk alone. He had traveled not to the city's concert hall but to a quiet town long since swallowed by history, a place where the stone walls still remembered footsteps now forgotten. He had spent a night there. No one knew where. No one asked. When he returned for the concert, he had not looked like a child. The expression he wore had belonged to someone far older, weighed down not by time, but by memory. And in the audience, he had seen him again, the man from the balcony, the same coat, the same gloves. But this time, he had smiled, and Elias had smiled back. The concert had begun under a sky heavy with snow. Inside the hall, breath had hung in the air like incense. Every ear had waited, every eye had searched for signs of the impossible. Elias had taken his place without ceremony. The music had flowed, not as performance, but as ritual. The notes had not been played. They had been released like birds long caged. When the final chord faded, the silence that followed had not been broken by applause. It had lingered, as if no one dared disturb what had just occurred. And then, movement. The man from the balcony had appeared once again, standing at the foot of the stage. He had approached slowly, each step echoing like a clock's final tick. This time, his voice had not needed to whisper. His words had been simple but final. "You were excellent, Ravel." No denial had come. Instead, Elias had replied, in Russian, "Thank you." The handshake that followed had not been one of greeting, but of release. Later that night, upon returning home, Elias had gone straight to bed. No words, no music, just the quiet shedding of a weight no longer his. That night, the dream returned, but the roles had reversed. This time, the prelude had echoed from the shadows again, but the one playing it sat inside the coffin, and the one approaching was not Elias. It was the composer. He had emerged from darkness not as a specter, but as a man restored, no longer hollow, no longer bound. His face had held neither sorrow nor triumph, only peace. And then, the final words had been spoken, not by voice but by heart. With that one act, our fates were joined. Through you I saw my homeland again, not with eyes but with feeling. My melodies, trapped for decades, unfinished and unheard, found their home in your hands. Now they belong to the world again. It does not matter under which name they are played. Music belongs to the one who gives it breath. You were my final silent note, the last phrase I could never write. The burden has lifted. The body is now yours again. When Elias awoke, the first light of dawn painted his room in gold. He sat in silence, then rose, walked to the piano, and for the first time in months he played something of his own. Not dictated by memory, not channeled from another soul, just his fingers, just his rhythm. The melody was imperfect, human, and it was beautiful.